Okay, let's move on to talk about Ukraine. Obviously, this is one of the most important geopolitical flashpoints. We kept an eye on it last time. Things have been updated. Last time we told you about how Biden and Putin were going to have a phone call. So the phone call has happened. Now, there's some interesting ways to parse this. On the one hand, Biden said that he was not basically, he ruled out any idea of unilateral U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine in response to a Russian invasion. But that does not mean that it's not still a very hard position against a potential Ukrainian invasion. Let's put this up there on the screen in terms of what he actually said. I thought this was the most noteworthy part that a lot of journalists are missing. President Biden told Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday, things we did not do in 2014, we are prepared to do now if Russia escalates in Ukraine, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reiterated that to the press. I found that very noteworthy because what they're basically saying is we're willing to go farther than we did to the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, which resulted in kicking Russia out of the G8, which resulted in all kinds of different sanctions, in the fact that Europe essentially like economically blockaded Russia for a couple of years till they decided they wanted that gas, and then they decided to forget about it.
But learn to
after a couple of years, like, you know, like it is what it is. Give me that gas. But again, what I said about unilateral. Put this up, the next one from Jennifer Jacobs. Asked if he would put troops on the ground in Russia, President Biden says if it were a NATO ally, we would of course have that obligation. True. But the U.S. won't unilaterally put U.S. troops on the ground. And he further went on to say it was very difficult to parse this answer. It was like 4 minutes, although we would have played it for you. But he was like, we're going to follow the lead of other people in the region. Now, Biden was getting some praise from people, Krystal, for saying, oh, he said he wouldn't put U.S. troops. But that's not what he said. He said that we wouldn't do it unilaterally. What he said is he opened the door to the idea that Poland, Latvia, Ukraine, Estonia, or whatever, any of the NATO countries in the area who might want to lead us as part of some coalition into Ukraine, he kept the door open to that. I think that's completely bonkers and crazy. I mean, what have we learned, people, from the last NATO mission, which was, most people don't know this, Libya, where NATO actually dragged us into the total morass of bombing in that country for some humanitarian mission. Totally worked out, right? Because, you know, Libya to this day is like, there's like modern slavery or whatever in Libya. And it's the #1 departure point for African migrants in the continent. It's basically completely split apart, and ISIS was there for a while. It's a hellhole. It's terrible. No, look, you know, I'm not criticizing Libyan people.
No disrespect
I'm saying,
to the Libyan people.
No disrespect.
Yeah,
I'm saying
in fact,
it's actually
all the
our
respect
fault.
to them. They deserve a lot better.
I agree. Listen, it sounds like a beautiful country, great food. Also, but what I can see is that it's very obvious that we got dragged. We had no idea what we were going to be doing in this country. And this is pure Beltway brain, because what it is, and what I mean by that, is that there is a very hot discussion right now in the United States, and especially in D.C., where people are saying, oh, the lesson from Afghanistan is that we have to show the world that we're willing to fight. And it's like, hold on a second.
What?
It's not all just about norms. It's about practicality. Ukraine is not a NATO ally. They have zero obligation for us under Article 5 in order to defend them. You also look at history. Ukraine has been part of the greater Russian Empire for like on and off for like 600 years. Yes, I know. Also part of the Polish, the German, etc., contested land. And none of this has anything to do with the Ukrainian people who deserve the best. I want the best for them and self-determination. But it's a sad, tough world. And sometimes larger states that desire conquest for their own desires are going to do that. And it comes down to whether us as the United States should do something about it or no. Like I said, Biden is not saying we're going to unilaterally do something, but I think that opening the door to potential U.S. deployment of troops on the ground in Ukraine would A, validate, you know, a lot of the doubts that the Russian people have and that Putin and them have around NATO encirclement of Russia and more. And second is that's just the last thing that we need right now. Well, literally the last thing that we need right now.
You can see in Biden's comments why Russia is so sensitive about the idea of having more NATO countries right on their border, because if Ukraine was a NATO, I mean, he's saying if Ukraine was a NATO ally, we'd be sending troops in.
Also, we did invite Ukraine into NATO. You know, people forget this, over 2 decades ago.
And, you know, counterintuitively perhaps, but I was mentioning this on the last show, Russia's moves have actually made the Ukrainian people more interested in joining NATO, where it was just a few years ago, like 12 to 14%. Now it's majority support. So his aggression has also backfired in terms of sentiment within the country. But, the other thing is here, even if you put aside the possibility of troops on the ground, which I think is a relatively remote possibility, because let me tell you, if you pulled that, what would it be? Like friggin' 5% of the public that'd be go troops in Ukraine? No one wants that. Not that our politicians always listen to what the people want, but even like the whole, we're gonna sanction them a lot more. And has this stuff worked?
It depends.
I mean, because you think about how's it worked in Cuba? How's it worked in Iran? How's it worked in Venezuela? Even with Russia, I mean, we sanctioned the hell out of them last time. Did that check their behavior? No.
Well, that's part of what I've been arguing this with a lot of friends. People are like, sanction them. I'm like, listen, that's great. You can do it. Okay. Are the Europeans who actually have them on the continent going to do anything about it? Because what happened last time? Merkel and all them, they talked a huge game. Nord Stream 2 was greenlit like 3 years later.
Even that, like oftentimes, this is happening in, we're going to talk about Saudi and Yemen. This is happening in Yemen right now. Saudi's calculus was, if we do this embargo, we make life miserable for the people of Yemen, well, that's going to cause the regime to fall. Well, it's been the opposite. It's sparked nationalist fervor. It's actually made the conflict more intractable, more entrenched. And so, they can have a backlash effect too. It's not like there's this thinking that, if we sanction them, we make life difficult for them, then it's going to force them to the table. Oftentimes it backfires because people are freaking stubborn and they feel like if we're being attacked and you're making our life difficult, hell no, we're not going to give you what you want. That's not going to happen. So, I mean, even again, if we just look at past history with Russia, this hasn't worked. And I don't care whether these oligarchs can get their money or whatever. I mean, that was the big thing that we did last time is like, let's try to make it difficult for the oligarchs. And I certainly have no love lost for them. But if you're going to actually go to the extent of trying to make life difficult for the Russian people, first of all, it's immoral. And second of all, even if you put the morality of it aside, it just doesn't really work. It hasn't worked with Russia. It hasn't worked with Cuba. It hasn't worked with Iran. It hasn't worked with Venezuela. So it's more, to me, a theater of like chest beating and let's show the world how tough we are and we're going to say no to Putin or whatever. Even as there's, I'm glad there's no willingness. Like nobody, some people do, but there's very little appetite among the American people to actually have troops on the ground in Ukraine. So I honestly think the sanctions and whatever, I think it's a silly direction to go in, even though I understand there's this desire, like we have to do something, but the something that we always do doesn't seem to actually work out.
Well, and I will say this, which is that, look, what does Putin say that he wants? And once again, look, he could be full of it. And in many cases has been very much so in the past. He's like, look, I want you to guarantee that you're not going to let Ukraine into NATO and that you're not going to continue to let NATO expand east. And I'm like, well, look, I mean, we said in the 1990s, you guys democratized, we're going to help you out, all of that. The idea that we're just going to encircle you around your border is a complete conspiracy. Oh, and then we let Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia into NATO. And then we bombed the Balkans and got involved again in Yugoslavia, which is a former Soviet Union country. I mean, they felt very emasculated, embarrassed. And I think a lot of people in DC delude themselves because they talk to like some democracy activist in Moscow and they're like, the Russian people really want democracy. Well, there's not a lot of evidence for that, actually. A lot of people in Russia really like Putin. Look, there's no way in order to actually parse what the actual data is. Does he actually have like 85% approval rating? Probably not. But, the history of that country and more is a much more deep comfort with authoritarian style government, especially in the rural parts. And they do have a yearning for the greatness of what was once the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. These types of moves are actually super popular amongst a lot of Russians. And anybody who's honest about what the state of the domestic politics in that country will probably tell you that. So it's just this European Western view of what they want Russia to be, as opposed to dealing with what it actually is, how it drives its internal calculus. I'm mentioning this because I just want peace in that region, right? I want what's best for us, the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. And ultimately, some of that is going to lead to some discomfort on our side to how that state is going to conduct itself. And having clear red lines as to when we get involved or not is equally important. Allowing a lot of this gray zone type conflict to infect us, where like, oh, we have to get involved. It's like, whoa, hold on a second. Nobody actually said that you did. Look, you invade Latvia? Okay, let's go. We have Article 5. That's different. But on Article 5, when it doesn't apply, then it becomes a nebulous kind of concept of norms and all that. That's exactly what got us bogged down in Afghanistan. That's how you went from a counterterrorism mission to we can't leave until every little Afghan girl knows how to code, apparently. And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's completely unrealistic and it has no basis in reality. And it may sound callous, but listen, this is about money and lives, more importantly, which is the lives of our soldiers and their own lives as well.
We didn't make life better in Afghanistan. No, I mean, it's a total catastrophe, and we're lied to. I mean, the money, the lives lost, all of that. It's a horror show. And you know, this is the other thing people didn't want to admit in Afghanistan, that there was a genuine desire among some to see the Taliban back in control.
Lot, actually, yeah.
Because the U.S. had, you know, backed these warlords who are horrific, child sex slaves and totally capricious and violent and uncertain and chaotic. And next thing you know, your hospital's getting bombed by coalition forces. I mean, it wasn't a good life under American occupation. And so it's also recognition of, like, what are we actually capable of doing? We're certainly not capable of, like, nation building and spreading democracy and all of this crap. So listen, we have bigger issues that we need to work on with Russia, including the Iran nuclear deal and including climate change. And this sort of tension and these skirmishes, it doesn't help anything. The other thing we wanted, I mentioned the Saudi piece. Yeah. And this is very troubling. So Biden came into office singing a very different tune on Saudi than either Trump or Obama had in the past, saying it was going to be a different day, and explicitly, you know, saying that we were no longer going to back them in this war against Yemen, which has been absolutely devastating. But they appear to have kind of changed their mind on all of that. Now they just backed, they whipped against an amendment to block aid to Saudi. And there were some interesting coalitions that were formed here. Let's go ahead and throw this Ken Klippenstein tweet up on the screen. So he says, despite candidate Biden's vow to make Saudi Arabia pariah following Khashoggi's murder, White House says it strongly opposes Congress's attempt to block $650 million missile sale to Saudi in new statements. So they didn't just take a hands-off approach here to those bipartisan actors who were trying to keep this money, this weapon sale, from ultimately going through. They actually put out a statement saying, no, it's important to us. We want this missile sale to go through. Very troubling, and again, different from what Biden had said in the past. And as I was mentioning, you know, there were some interesting actors, some interesting bipartisan coalition going on here for once in the correct direction, which is to try to end our support of this devastating war. Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders agreeing with one another on the Senate floor. Let's take a listen to that.
And we are complicit. We are arming the Saudis and allowing this to happen. Offensive, defensive, they shouldn't get any of our weapons. We should stop selling them any weapons until they stop starving the country of Yemen.
President, I find myself in the somewhat uncomfortable and unusual position of agreeing with Senator Paul.
And, you know, Senator Paul makes a good point there, which is like, people try to parse this, oh, it's offensive versus defensive. That's kind of nonsense. Because the reality is, if Saudi wasn't bombing them, then they wouldn't need these defensive capabilities that they're trying to get us to sell. So ultimately very disappointing and just a total breach of what they had promised before from this White House with regards to Saudi.
It's a very odd amalgam. It's like, what is the Biden foreign policy? Kind of whatever the guy
feels all over the place.
On one thing. Every once in a while, turns out well, like Afghanistan. I know it's a controversial statement. Sometimes he's like some very, you know, NATO brain of 1974, like we are in the Ukraine situation. And then sometimes on the Saudi thing, it's just good old-fashioned, you know, swamp Washington style business as usual. So you never know what you're going to get with Joseph R. Biden whenever it comes to foreign policy, and that's always been kind of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, the policies have been very different from Trump, but that ad hoc, like, I like this one, I'm going to do something here, I'm going to not do something there, is very Trumpy, you know, that there's not really an overarching, even though he talked about an overarching scheme, but in reality, it was very ad hoc what Trump did. And this is what, you know, what we predicted based on what we were reading about Biden as well, that it would be very sort of like relational, how he felt about a place, how he felt about a particular ruler. And that's ultimately what we've seen.
That's right.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.